IVM. Welcome to another episode of This Round is on Me. My guest today is a pioneer of television journalism in India with an experience spanning over 23 years as an anchor reporter and a frontline correspondent. She's best known for being the host of an iconic television show, We the People, and The Buck Stops Here. She's an author and most recently launched her own YouTube channel called Mojo Stories. She's the winner of dozens of international and national awards, including one of the highest civilian honors in India, the Padma Shri, and not once, but was twice listed in the World Economic Forum's top 100 global leaders of tomorrow. She's also an opinion columnist for the Hindustan Times as well as the Washington Post. While we haven't met in person, we became acquainted during the lockdown. I had been closely following her work as she reported about the migrant worker crisis for over 3 months on the road. And when she finally ended up in Bombay, I felt the least I could do was feed her and her amazing team some good food. Barkha, thank you so much for making the time to be here today. Barkha, you built your career in television media. How has television news changed over the past 2 decades?
Well, Gauri, you really started with my favorite subject, which is the lament, the anger, the sadness at what television news has become in India. You know, I often call myself a child of television. And what I mean by that is that unlike many other journalists of my generation who moved from newspapers into television, I was a first generation television journalist. I did my master's. I have 2 masters. I did my first master's in mass communication and actually joined NDTV at the time to become a sound engineer. And that was my big passion. So I used to do sound. And I wanted to become a producer. I wanted to make movies. And then I stumbled into television news. There wasn't even private news channels when I started out, but I absolutely loved it. And at that time, it was really about telling stories, giving voice to people who did not have a voice. And for me, journalism was always about going out there, reporting from the toughest places in the country, sometimes in the world, and bringing back those stories. But as the years went by and what we see today, you see comedy mostly on your prime time, and comedy would be too benign a phrase. You sometimes see hate, you see manufactured sort of disagreements, you see extreme voices brought from side A versus side B to deliberately set them off against each other. You often see communal discourse, you see gaslighting of people, you see media trials, kangaroo courts. If I were a young kid in college today looking at this television, I would not become a journalist. And it's one of a couple of reasons that I migrated out, hung on to my love for the visual medium, hung on to my love for storytelling and video as an instrument of storytelling. But I just do not see myself in Indian TV news again.
Well, yeah, you already answered my next question, which was, what made you take the plunge? And I think, you've answered that.
Well, let me just add something to it. One was just the disappointment and the disillusionment of what was happening. And the other thing was that after 22, 23 years, you just get tired of being an employee and you want to own what you create, right? And I mean, I know you have had your own entrepreneurial journey with all the fabulous sort of restaurants you run and bring all that food to our table. And I have to take this moment to tell your viewers that during the pandemic, when I was traveling across India and often we didn't have food to eat because everything was shut, I will never forget that you sent us food to eat and you didn't even know me then. And it was such a kind gesture that it will always stay with me. So thank you. But to come back to why I broke free from television, one was disillusionment and the second was wanting to be the owner of my little corner of the sky and not having to just constantly be an employee. So I think the combination of those 2 impulses.
But tell me, how difficult is it to be an independent journalist today in India without the support of the deep pockets of big media houses?
It's very tough. It's very, very, very tough. It's also because we live in such polarized times and people are sadly, many people, not all, there are still many brave people, but many people are quite terrified about not just expressing an opinion, but even coming out and supporting things and people and individuals that they believe in. And I've had so many sort of big corporate friends, and some of them are my friends, say to me that we'd love to support you, we'd love to finance you, we'd love to fund you, but can you find some...
Off the record.
Off the record, or can you do something else that's non-journalistic and we'll fund that? So there's a kind of fear of independent journalism, which is tragic, but I still think that there is reason to be optimistic. And I'll tell you why. One is that market forces cannot be ignored. And market forces tell you that consumption is moving to the phone, to the laptop, to the iPad, right? So there's no escaping the fact that the digital is not just the future, it is the present. Secondly, there's no escaping the fact that people like podcasts, people like videos, and often text is not read through till the end. Even for us, we have to find imaginative ways of, one is the masterpiece that we do, and then taking out the little bits that are called bite-sized nuggets. So content is moving to these platforms, and sponsors and funders will not be able to ignore that. The second very healthy trend that I see is that the audience, the viewer, is actually quite willing to pay for content. And, we started this as a very minor experiment. We haven't actually fully gone with it at the Mojo Story Up, my platform. When I was traveling, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about this, but when I was traveling through India for COVID and reporting, I traversed 24,000 kilometers. And when it was all done, I just sort of, as an experiment, said, you know what, we're a self-funded startup, and I'm not going to put money on this content and block it off to my viewers. But if you believe that independent journalism should be supported, pay what you think is appropriate. And people paid between 50 rupees to 50,000 rupees, whatever they could afford. Some, few individuals paid more. And it was just an experiment. And I wanted to understand the sense of the market responsiveness. And I know as I build and scale that one of the things we will be looking to do is to have an audience funded, not exclusively, but a big part of our funding we do expect to come from a subscription model. And I see globally that is the pattern. And I think that is going to be the future of digital media and how it counters big media or corporate media.
I mean, look at what's happening down under, right? I mean, where they're being, Facebook's being forced to pay for news. And I completely agree with you, which is that on the point that, sponsors can't ignore this format anymore. I mean, just like I talk about this with my producers for the podcast, and, podcasts in India are such a nascent form right now, but you can't ignore it. It's a format that you can't ignore.
It's not even the future. This is the present.
Exactly.
And that was one of the reasons also for me to get out of TV, right? It was disillusionment.
Becoming obsolete.
Yeah, it's becoming obsolete. It's anyway, people who watch it are like, with no offense, are, really old people.
Yeah.
Or like if it's on in the background, almost on mute. People read TV now if they watch it at all.
I have to tell you, my husband, who is American and, he's here in body, but he's there in spirit. Every morning he wakes up and he switches on the news on YouTube because that's where right. He's consuming his US news. Yeah. And I can't remember the last time we even put on.
I don't remember the last time I turned on television. Like my Tata Sky, I don't even know why I pay for it anymore because I don't use it.
Yeah. So I've heard you talk about the struggle to find a balance on the one hand between being an unbiased journalist reporting the news, and on the other hand, the fact that one only really has a following when you take a stand and lean one way, right? Mm-hmm. So how have you managed this balance?
So I've been defiant on this, right? So I have a Hindi phrase for this, and I say that the tragedy of Indian media today across genres is that it is either chamcha ya morcha, which loosely translated means that either they're supplicants to power or they think of themselves as activists, right? I think of myself as neither of these things. God forbid that I'll ever be a supplicant to anybody or anything, never. But I actually don't think it's my job, except for a very few set of issues on which I think there is no other side, and I'll talk about those, except for those issues that are really sacred and I believe are one-sided issues. I think it's my job to report a story and to let the audience decide. I think it's my job to bring in views and even people who make me uncomfortable. I think it's my job to force myself out of the echo chamber. You mentioned the US. American media has struggled with this. They got the first Trump win wrong because liberal media was in its echo chamber. And that polarization in the US media is now starting to reflect in the Indian media. And I don't want to be in that trap. Now, it makes my job tougher because what audiences want now is for content to reconfirm their own bias. So when you say something that makes them uncomfortable or they intuitively disagree with, there's a pushback. But I still believe that it's possible. I still believe that in the long game, the respect will be yours because A, you're surprising your audience. Just when they think they've slotted you, you do something, that is counterintuitive in their mind. The second thing is, are there some issues on which there's no other side? Yes. For me, they often concern issues of, for example, sexual violence, abuse, rape, if you're going to talk about that, if you're going to talk about gay rights, if you're going to talk just about basic principles of equality between people, I don't think there's another side. I'm quite happy to take a stand, and I do. Where I feel that a stand should not be taken is on, overt political or electoral biases. I think your work should not speak to one party or the other. I think that's very, very important to keep your voting preference as far away from your journalism as is possible. And I also think you can't be so blinded by personal ideology that you forget to read the pulse of the people, right? So for example, I may think A, but if 90% of India thinks B, it may be something that I think is terrible, but I still have to try and understand it, right? So I do try. I mean, it's not always a perfect score, but I do try. I keep at it, and I keep saying, even to my small team, and young people in their 20s come with very definitive ideas of what's right and wrong, and I keep saying, please let your journalism do the talking instead of you doing the talking. And I think we just need more and more of our journalists to understand this. We don't want to hear what you think. We want to hear what your work thinks. And I think if we just follow that rule, work can speak quite powerfully.
You're absolutely right. And I was going to ask you, what qualities make a good journalist according to you? And I think you've answered that. But do you feel the credibility of the media is going down? Or is it? Yeah.
It's partly because of, and mostly I think because of what's happened to television, but it's also because mainstream media has failed, let's say the biggest story of our time, which was COVID. When I stepped out, I didn't know that I was going to be on the road for 24,000 kilometers when I first set out. I just went out to see what was happening at the borders of Delhi where I live. And I suddenly saw men and women and children walking, leaving the city, leaving India's capital. And I realized in one instant that there was a humanitarian crisis upon us that was going to be larger than possibly the medical crisis of the COVID pandemic. And subsequently, I spent like 130 days just traveling across India, and the exodus of migrant workers. And I'm not saying it's something I'd covered before as a journalist, but just to see this mass migration, the biggest migration of people since the partition of India, I would go, and other than a smattering of local reporters, local to that place, or photographers, I saw no big media presence. Not till 60 days or 70 days into this crisis did television emerge from its studio, from behind its tables to cover this story. So, people were just tired of seeing the same 4 experts on television, the same 4 doctors, no disrespect to the doctors, giving the same gyan. And I take that as an example of big media having missed its moment, but credibility is also going down because of the sort of tragicomedy you see on prime time. But I will add one thing here, and I always say this to people who do media bashing, like, okay, it's great that you have strong opinion, but then start supporting the media you like, start supporting the media you respect, start paying for news, pay to keep news free, and don't watch what you hate, even in morbid fascination. A lot of times I'll hear people say, oh, I was watching this guy because, I thought, let me see what he's up to today. But the moment you provide an eyeball, you're providing the advertisers a reason to advertise with something that you actually don't respect. So as an audience, we say we get the governments we deserve, we also get the media we deserve. I'm not passing the buck. We're responsible for a lot of what's wrong with our profession. But the audience has the remote. You have the remote, you have the power to click or not click. And that power will always rest with the people.
And I think what you're sort of suggesting is, in a way, is that the news isn't meant to be entertainment. It's supposed to be news, right? So if you're kind of drawn to something because it's providing you entertainment,
that's not news.
Yeah, exactly.
But I'm not absolving myself of the necessary art to tell a good story. So I'll pick up migrant workers, for example. So if I had spent my life in those 3 months during the pandemic and the lockdown lecturing people, saying, oh, you rich people, why don't you feel guilty about how our poor are out on the streets? That would have been the correct moral principle for me, but it would have been a really bad way to tell a story, right? So again, it comes back to my earlier point. Don't tell me your opinion. Show me the story. And, I had a teacher at Columbia Journalism School who used to say, show, don't tell. And I think Indian journalists have just forgotten show, don't tell. And so while news is not meant to be entertainment, we still remain obligated to tell a good story, because if I don't tell a good story, you're not going to pay attention, right? So I looked for ways to find powerful visuals, to give it a narrative that was a story, because in the end, we are storytellers. We're not entertainers, but we're storytellers. And I just see the two things as different.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But how can the industry ensure that everyone is practicing responsible journalism? I mean, what do you think can be done about this?
This pushback has to come from 2 sets of people, from the advertisers and from the audience, right? We saw some pushback from the advertisers. We saw Rajiv Bajaj, for example, taking a position saying he would not fund channels that he thought, or content that he thought promoted hate. And I'm like, hurrah, That's a start, right? And we saw a couple of other companies express disquiet. I think Parle-G was one of them, saying we don't want to be associated with content that is breaking norms of decency. But, I just think that if more and more people start supporting, whether you do it, and not all support has to be financial. Like, even if you just sign up for a YouTube channel that you like, even if you just provide like a reader endorsement to a website that you like, right? Like, a lot of people keep writing to me. Even last week, they were like, how can we support you? And I said, you can support me by going onto YouTube and clicking on Mojo Story and becoming a subscriber. I'm not even charging for content yet. I might one day. But the more volume you bring to the journalists you like, the more competitive you're making them, because in the end, we're not going to survive at the largest of anybody. We're going to survive in the market. We have to compete in the market. So if you don't like the media you're getting, please support the media you like. And till that pushback happens, till people start looking at content as something that's critical to their lives, to their sense of information, to their sense of knowledge. And if news media is regarded as this casual entertainment space that you don't have to express an opinion on, we'll keep getting this shitty media.
Yeah. So let's deep dive a little bit into the digital world that you've now entered. Yeah. To a layman like me, can you explain how different the TRP scam is to buying likes, followers, views on digital platforms? So, I mean, actually, before you answer that, I just want to explain to our listeners what TRP is. The full form is television rating point, and it's the measure of how a show's success on TV screens, and it's used to evaluate which program has been most viewed on TV screens. So last year, it was alleged that certain channels were manipulating the results by paying people to keep the channel running on their TVs through the day. So now coming back to the question.
Yeah. So firstly, a TRP, a television rating point, just to add one line to what you said, is all of you, is all of us, right? It's right. Measuring what we watch. So the TRP scam is, of course, explained very simply. Here's an example of how it can be manipulated. Suppose you pay someone to leave the television set on channel A for 8 hours. Right? That automatically skews the outcome. And it is one of the worst kept secrets of the trade. And I'm glad that we finally lifted the lid off it. And so that's the TRP scam. It's a great question to say, how is this different for purchasing eyeballs online? So personally, I think that the difference is that you can market or spend money on telling more people that you exist. So far, very minimal cash that I've spent on like maybe promoting Mojo Story or We the Women, the two properties that I work on, has been to amplify my presence. I have never paid to say, click on this link. I have never paid to make someone watch it. I have only paid to say I exist, in much the same way as, for example, if you want to talk about the table, I mean, everybody knows in Mumbai, but let's say you were coming to Delhi and you'd be like, listen, I need to put some marketing budget on telling people that the table exists. But after that, if we come and eat at your restaurant, if we don't love the food, we're not going to come again. So similarly, I can pay to say Mojo exists, but if you come to my content and you don't like it, you're not going to come back. I'm not bribing you to watch me, right?
There are people who do pay to,
And if they do that, that's no different. And if they do that, it is morally, ethically, just not different to what people do or have done in television. There is no difference. If you're purchasing followers for your network, if you are purchasing bots to say, hey, great program, Barkha, that's just crap. And it's ethically just as problematic as how TRPs are manipulated. But I think it's completely ethical to put money to amplify your presence, because how people going to get to know you exist.
Absolutely. I mean, we do that for our brands as well. And like you said, that, when you're on a digital space, so we do it with our delivery brands where we don't have a physical space and the only place you exist is online. So
and it's a fragmented market, right?
Exactly.
And I don't know where this god of SEO is, but like I haven't found her or him. So please, if you know them, please send them to me, because we've tried keywords and keywords takes you so far and no further.
Get in queue. Get in the line.
The bizarre things, like I have to put my own name in every caption because apparently I'm a keyword. But I can't market like this. So like everyone's Googling Barkha that, so I have to put my name in every bloody story I do. It's a hilarious situation. So you have to put money to be found, to be discovered, right? Yeah. But not for the click, not for the view. I would never do that. And if anyone who's doing that, that's just plain wrong.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think that, we are seeing more regulation happen even in sort of social media and the digital space. Yeah. But the flip side of that is, gagging of free speech. Yeah. And, how do you feel about sort of regulation of social media and its effect on journalism?
Right. So I'm, as someone who, for example, for years has been, as many women and outspoken women in India are at the receiving end of defamatory and sometimes violent threats online, I will never be a person to suggest that social media is this wild, wild west which cannot be regulated. I think we have to be subject to the same laws of the land. And by the way, we are. You can be taken to court for a tweet. You can be taken to court for a YouTube video. All of these platforms and the content that we place on them are already under the jurisdiction of the law of the land. So that's the first point, that there's a misimpression being created that we are unregulated. The second point is, I do agree with the idea of a self-regulatory body for the digital content world, because it does exist for television, it does exist for newspapers, but it should be self-regulatory, not government regulated. That's the first point. And the second point is that some of these new regulations that have come out are quite problematic because they're very ambivalent and they're very ambiguous. So for example, just to give you an example, the new guideline says that anything that is unlawful can be taken down. Now, X number of years ago, to promote the idea of equality for the LGBTQ community was illegal. There were criminals in our country. So are you going to take that down? Just giving you an example. It may be an extreme example, but tomorrow if somebody wants to do it, they can. The second very vague clause in these guidelines is public order. That's something that challenges public order. Now, I have a problem with the government determining that, because there could be stories that don't suit the government, and the government, any government, not this government, not the center versus state, any political party is going to want to control information. That's the nature of politics, which is why you don't give any government that power. So for the government to define what is public order without it being specified in the guidelines, it needs a much more textural elaboration. Basically means that tomorrow we could be reporting the farmers' protests and an authority figure could tell you that, you're disturbing public order. So I have a kind of problem with the ambivalence. And as digital news media, we have as a collective written to the government saying that we would like further consultations. We would like to be invited for a dialogue, and we would like to be able to construct a set of guidelines together. And I do believe that there is a need for a regulatory body, but that regulatory body must be an industry body and cannot be a government body.
It has to be independent, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. Does it worry you that we can virtually count on one hand the number of maverick women reporters, anchors, editors like you who are coming up in the industry, as a whole?
What worries me is the changing nature of journalism. There was a time when this industry drew a certain kind of passionate, slightly eccentric, very, very hungry, obsessive kind of person, male or female. Obviously, it was always tougher for women to break through. And I used to think, as a person who had established herself with a lot of battling, and that battle continues even today, it was my job to encourage more women into this profession. What is tragic is that, because we made television less reporting driven, because we made it more anchor driven, we started putting more and more premium on how television hosts looked and dressed and wore their makeup. This sort of, Instagram generation, which is so exhibitionist and voyeuristic. We made it all about, it's almost like we picked up that pouty Instagram persona and put it in a way on mainstream media. So journalism became less important and every other crap became more important. And that is why today you feel that maverick energy missing, because we changed the nature of what's happening on the screen, and therefore the kind of people it's drawing has changed, right? And that's why you feel this scarcity. When I set out to hire people, I feel so hampered by the fact that there isn't enough maverick energy out there, or maybe that maverick energy has gone into other professions, and we're not getting it anymore in media, male or female, by the way.
Yeah.
So it's what we've done to this medium.
You mentioned earlier that it was harder for women to get into this space. Why is that?
Well, it's harder for women to get into any space. Firstly, women will have to work twice as hard as men to get to the same place. There are assignments that you have to battle for. I will never forget how much effort it took me to convince both my organization and the army to let me into Kargil in 1999 to report the India-Pakistan war from the front line. The reasons that are given are often quite paternalistic. There are no bathrooms. There is no place to sleep. It's like the Chief Justice who said women farmers should not be out in the cold at the protests. And then you go and talk to the women farmers and they're like, I remember a woman who told me, I know how to wield a gun. I can cross the Satluj River on my own. You think this winter bothers me. But there's a lot of this kind of benign paternalism that is offered to you, right, by people. And sometimes it's downright hostile, right? So there is all kinds of things. The Priya Ramani case tells us there's sexual harassment at the workspace, but women are often silent because you still want that assignment. You don't want your speaking up about harassment to be used against you're being kept out of spaces. The other thing that women struggle with, and we just don't talk about this enough, is the lack of equality at home. So we talk so much about equality at work, and we spend all our energy on making our workspaces more equal. But women who have to juggle more of the household work, have to juggle more of the parenting, are never going to be able to pursue personal ambitions in the same way that their male counterparts can. And therefore, I always say that, the biggest disservice we did to women was to use this label superwomen, because all that it really means is that we want women to do more work at home than men and also work outside, right? And that I think is just shit, but it's one of the reasons that more and more women drop out of the workforce. India's female labor force participation has been steadily declining. If I was to de-jargonize that, it simply means fewer women are working today than used to even 10 years ago, which is alarming. And the last reason is some of our socialization. I consider myself as a feminist free from socialization, but in my life, I've never been able to walk into a room and ask for money in the way that men have. And that's me. And I have no coyness in me. And the only coyness I have is about money. And then when I speak to women, there's so many women who tell me the same thing. So even the strongest of us are not free from this, the stereotypical socialization. So, those are a set of reasons.
Yeah. But you're right. The equality sort of has to begin at home. You've covered some really heart-wrenching stories, be it during war, terrorist attacks, and of course, recently the migrant workers. How do you stay strong during reporting such painful stories?
So I suppose, not to put myself at the same level, but it's a little bit like you acquire a surgeon's skill, right? So you know how to be. So with me, I think mostly, though there are times I have lost my nerve on camera and there are times I've broken down, there are times I've cried on camera, but mostly I have an even keel when I'm telling the story, because my mind races ahead to very mundane things like, how will I get this story on camera? What are the questions I need to ask? And how will I get it published, previously on air on time? And that energy in trying to be cogent displaces either fear or sadness for that moment. And therefore, I'm able to function. But I think what happens is once the story is told, it does leave a damaging impact. I think that it does make me, for example, a much more volatile individual than I may have been had I not been a journalist. It makes me quite brittle with emotion. It makes me quick to temper and tears and laughter as well. So I think I have a pendulum on my emotions. I'm not the most steady person off camera, but I am very steady on camera while telling that story. But the effort it takes to be that steady in those very extreme moments does take a cost on the rest of your life and the rest of your personality.
I wanted to you mentioned your life off camera. Your work is such that you have to be at the scene of the story within hours to report on it. I saw you went to, Uttarakhand recently when the floods happened. And it's such a demanding job because the news waits for no one. And now, especially since you have become an entrepreneur, how on earth do you manage to have any semblance of a personal life in this profession?
I think you almost can't. And if you do, then you have to surround yourself with people who get that about you, right? And if they don't get that about you, you're just not going to connect to them at all in any meaningful way, right? So they have to get, like in my case, you have to get about me that my first love or my primary love will be to respond to that emerging, developing story, that I am the kind of person who on a Sunday night was out for dinner with my colleagues and then said at that dinner, let's go to Uttarakhand, and then got into the car at midnight and left for Uttarakhand. And it took us 22 hours to reach the tunnel and our backs were broken. And, there was literally, it was a crazy but necessary act. So it was 40 hours on the road, if you added the going, the coming, and then the hours we spent there. But as I stood at that tunnel where the workers were trapped inside, suddenly the fatigue lifted, right? So the point is that anyone who knows me personally has to get this about me. And if they don't get this about me, they don't get me. And so am I ever going to have a regular structured life in my free time? No. I don't know what free time is because I'm constantly wired. I'm constantly wondering what's happening and responding to it. But even spaces such as they're never going to be regular or structured. So I'm never going to have a typical personal life. I'm never going to have a typical set of relationships. It's not going to happen in my life. And I kind of know that about myself and I've made my peace with it.
Absolutely. one minute you're looking at death threats, the next minute you're dealing with trolling, and another time you're having FIRs slapped on you for doing your job.
Yeah.
How do you handle the stress of this job?
By eating a lot.
Actually,
no, I eat for every mood. I had a T-shirt at the journalism school in Columbia which said, "I write for food." I think that's me. I eat for every mood. I convert even the toughest journeys into food expeditions. I have eaten off every pavement, every village that I have ever been to. I have had, and literally, and I've obviously got a strong tummy from all of it. I love food enough to want to experience, the poshest places if I can, but also I eat from everywhere. And
you just stole my next question, because I wanted to sort of end this on a brighter note and, of obviously personal interest to me. Tell us more about your food experience traveling the length and breadth of the country in the last 1 year. I mean, did you get to try?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm so jealous of this.
I can't tell you, it's like in the toughest
It's a perk.
time.
It's the one perk of the job, right?
I remember okay, so in the first month of these COVID travels, there was no food, right? Like literally, because everything was shut, and even like dhabas were not open because everything was mandated to be shut. And literally, I remember days of biscuit and namkeen and thumbs up. But as it started opening, even then there was a lot of hesitation. And I remember I was driving from Mumbai, Pune, Kolhapur, and then to Hyderabad. And that's the journey we had followed to get to Kerala. And I remember this one dhaba, and he was like, "Listen, I can't serve you in front of the restaurant because the cops will come. I'm not supposed to be open." And we were like, "Please give us some food." So we went inside like it was his home. And he gave us this, this dal with lal mirch, just whole red chilies and this much oil, and the roti straight out of the tandoor. And in my life, I think I've never had such an intense sort of feeling about dal, but that is how it was. And I mean, just being able to eat the local cuisine of all of these states that one traveled to, right? To have the litti chokha in Bihar, to have the Malabar paratha in Kerala, to have the when the street vendors returned and the Golgappa wala redis returned to all of these Mufassal towns, because the little villages opened up before the big cities did, right? So you could have one little redi wala near some railway station. And I ate all of it. And literally, I think I eat for anxiety, I eat for joy, I eat in sadness, I eat because I'm an adventurer, I eat because I'm a traveler. So for me, one of the ways I do deal with everything that I deal with is by eating. And the other really weird habit I have is that I'm obsessed with murder mysteries and I'm obsessed with espionage. So I will binge watch. I don't sleep much, so there's enough time to binge watch. So these are my two stress busters.
That's fabulous. So what is your go-to comfort food, if you had to pick one thing?
Always aloo in any form. Potatoes in any form, and chaat in any form. Like always. And always red wine anytime.
Not maybe with the aloo, but...
with anything. Give me plonk, I'll have it. Give me a Pinot Noir or Malbec, I'll have it. I happily traverse highbrow and lowbrow in content and food and life. So that's me.
Okay. One person in the world you'd like to interview, and what would be the topic of discussion?
At the moment, I'd really like to interview Kamala Harris. I think I definitely have a girl crush on her. I've had it for a while. She fascinates me for being multicultural, biracial. She fascinates me also for being this middle-aged woman who just seems so spunky, because otherwise I think there's this sense of making older women, rendering them invisible. And if they are visible, then they treat themselves as older. And I think I kind of relate to this. I'm 49 and I don't feel old at all, right? I don't feel old at all. I think I pack more energy than pretty much every 20-something I know. And so I look at Kamala Harris and I'm like, this is my woman, because she just seems so energized and so passionate and so herself. And at the same time, she seems tough and not precious. And the whole idea of, this thing of female energy having to be precious, that just pisses me off. So I see Kamala Harris, and then I see this sort of very comfortable equation with her partner. He's clearly not as well known. That whole equation. I mean, there's so much about her sneakers with her pantsuits. Like the fact that she doesn't have to be some fashionista to wield power. Like all of that is so compelling.
Yeah. And what would you ask her? That we don't all already know.
That's a good question. I mean, I think I would ask her what keeps her awake at night. I always think that the way to get to know people is to ask them, and people don't ask people this enough, right? I mean, I remember I once asked Amitabh Bachchan, what keeps you awake at night? And Mr. Bachchan is the toughest person to interview because he never lets his guard down. And the only real answer he's ever given me was in response to that. And he said, I think one day I'll walk into a restaurant and nobody will recognize me. And I was like, are you serious? And he was like, yeah, I keep worrying even now that one day I will walk into a restaurant and nobody will recognize me. And so I'd love to know for Kamala Harris, as this first woman vice president, when she sleeps at night, now, what keeps her awake in that personal moment?
So what keeps you awake?
The fear of not meeting my own standards. I fear failing a lot, and I define success and failure completely on my own terms. And when I fall short of my own standard, I find that I feel so much anger at myself. So when I'm awake at night, it's mostly because I'm worrying about not getting that 10 out of 10 that I need to give myself. I worry a lot about that.
I know. I understand that completely. If not a journalist, what would you be doing?
I'd be a lawyer. I still want to be a lawyer. I even went to get the examination entrance papers for the law faculty exam. And then I looked at it and I didn't know anything because it was a lot of random GK trivia. And I was like, okay, now in my 40s, can't fail an exam. But it is very much a dream to be a lawyer. It's still a dream.
So I read law at university, but I think I was motivated by watching all these legal dramas on
Weren't
TV.
we all?
Yeah. So I actually acted on it.
Good for you. So I need to figure out a way to at least clear that entrance exam and then decide whether I want to do something with it or not.
Okay. Seeing and reporting about the country from multiple perspectives, what's your one message to every Indian on what we can do to make our country a better place to live in? I know you've mentioned a lot earlier, but
I won't say anything big. Like for me, this country was built on what Amartya Sen called the spirit of the argumentative Indian. And I just feel that arguments are great, but arguments were never personal. And what really bothers me about the public discourse in this country today is that all arguments seem so personal, right? I think it's absolutely okay to disagree with somebody and still have a drink with them or eat a samosa with them or a plate of chaat with them or a slice of pizza, which I'm counting on you to provide me because the pictures you put up look so bloody fabulous. And I think we need to reclaim that spirit of happy arguments, right? Be less sort of personally divided. And by the way, the one thing that I really found life affirming in my travels during the pandemic and the lockdown is how kind people were. So, I'd experienced all this trolling, etc. But I had strangers. I had complete strangers opening up homes, giving me food, giving me shoes, giving me clothes.
Fixing your car.
Fixing my car. Yeah. Somebody called and offered to do my laundry. People sent hampers of khana. You did, and so many people did. And it was just, you have to remind yourself to not respond to trolls. And you have to remind yourself that they are not the country. And so all I want to say to every Indian out there is let us hold on to our argumentative spirit, but it doesn't have to be personal.
Barkha, this has been an absolute treat. I can't thank you enough for
not at all. Thank you for
taking
having
the time.
me.
And I know I have to let you go, but I wish I could spend more time with you and hopefully see you very, very soon in Bombay.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
I don't know if having Barkha as my guest today boosted my podcast equivalent of TRPs or not, but this was definitely one of the highlights of my stint as a podcast host and why I love podcasting so much. I hope you enjoyed tuning into the show today. And if you like this show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM Podcast Network. You can listen to us on the IVM Podcasts app or website or wherever else you get your podcasts from. You can also follow us on social media. We're at IVM Podcasts on Twitter and Instagram. And if you want to reach out to me, I'm at GDevidyal on Instagram and at Gory Details on Twitter.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Would like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, Ciet. We really do appreciate your support. We have a new show on the network. It's called The Fighting Goat. And if you love fighting sports, tune in every Wednesday with hosts Arjun and Somesh. They also featured, by the way, on Cyrus Says this week, where the three fitness freaks bonded over their love for TV sports and sports in general. Tune in to This Round Is On Me, where Gauri celebrated her 25th anniversary with Kavita Rajwade, who is my co-founder at the IVM Podcast Network. They give us details about how this show was curated, and they talk about podcasts in general. On The Habit Coach, Ashton highlighted our addiction to screens, how we are glued to either a big laptop screen or a small mobile screen all day. He shared some tips on how to rectify this unhealthy lifestyle. On All Things Policy, Anirudh Kanisetti spoke to Pratik Wagre and Rohan Sheth about the new internet guidelines that were issued by the Government of India recently and their impact on content creators and platforms. On the Filter Coffee podcast, Karthik invited Vivek Ram, who is a celebrated animation artist. They chatted about his stint with animation and starting his own studio called Vanar Sena, bringing to life stories from ancient India and his scriptures with animation as his vehicle. We had Dhanya Rajendran, the editor of the News Minute, on the Note with Maruk Inayat. It was a deep dive into the digital newsroom and the upkeep of truth in a fake news pandemic. And with that, we hope to see you again next week.
Hi, I'm Zarina Poonawalla, host of the Empowering Series podcast on the IVM network. I happen to be a peak performance coach and leadership coach by profession, and I'm here to share with you productivity tools, life-altering techniques, and real-life hacks to help you achieve your maximum potential in everything you do, your relationships, professions, careers. So tune in every Monday to unleash your inner power. Be safe, be well, be empowered.